It all began in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everything was meant to look the same. Identical lawns, identical mailboxes, identical smiles at the HOA meetings. It was the kind of place where conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. And for the longest time, that never really bothered me. My wife and I had moved there for peace and stability. We liked the clean streets, the polite neighbors, and the sense that everyone respected their space. But as I would soon learn, there's always one person in every neighborhood who takes that sense of order and turns it into a crusade. Her name was Karen. Karen lived directly next door. Her house, a mirror image of mine, right down to the beige paint and the perfectly trimmed hedges. But Karen's yard was more than just tidy. It was a statement. Every blade of grass was cut to regulation height. Every flower pot approved by the HOA's aesthetic committee. And every trash can stored out of sight before the sun went down. She was the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood. Standard. The trouble began when I decided to replace my old, rotting wooden fence. The previous owner had installed it years ago, and the thing was practically falling apart. I had just gotten a new puppy, and I wanted a safe, enclosed yard. So I ordered a new 6-foot privacy fence, something sturdy, clean, and compliant with all local ordinances, or so I thought. The morning the construction started, I noticed Karen standing on her driveway, arms folded, watching the workers like a hawk. She didn't say anything that first day, but I could feel the disapproval radiating from her like heat off asphalt. By the second day, she started pacing near the property line, glaring every time a post went in. And by the third day, she finally decided to make it official by calling the cops. That afternoon, a patrol car rolled up. The officer stepped out, clearly uncomfortable. He said there had been a complaint about a fence violating neighborhood standards. I explained that I had a permit, showed him the paperwork, and after a quick check, he confirmed everything was perfectly legal. He left with a polite nod, apologizing for the inconvenience. But Karen didn't take the loss well. The next day, I found a letter taped to my door. It was from the HOA, claiming my fence was disruptive to the neighborhood's aesthetic cohesion. I was instructed to remove or lower it to 4 feet or face daily fines. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules or aesthetics. It was about control. Karen wasn't content with living next to me. She wanted to manage me. At first I tried to reason with the HOA. I showed them my permits, the city regulations, and even photos proving other fences in the area were taller. But none of it mattered. Karen had friends on the board, people who shared her obsession with uniformity, and they were more than happy to back her up. The letters kept coming. The fines started piling up. Every day, I'd get another notice reminding me that I was out of compliance. It got to the point where checking my mailbox filled me with dread. Weeks went by. My once peaceful home started feeling like a battleground. Then, one evening, as I was standing in my yard staring at that fence, something in me snapped. I had played by the rules. I had done everything right. And still it wasn't enough. That's when a wild, petty idea began forming in my head. If they wanted to make a fuss about my fence, fine. I'd give them something worth talking about. Instead of tearing it down, I'd build it bigger. Not just taller or wider, but grander. A statement piece. Something that would turn their aesthetic cohesion into a running joke. It started as a small thought, a flicker of mischief. But the more I considered it, the more it grew. I stayed up late sketching designs, flipping through photos of old castles, stone fortresses, and medieval gates. The vision became clearer with each passing day. Turrets, stone-textured panels, decorative battlements, even a working drawbridge for the driveway. If they wanted to complain about my fence, I'd give them a wall. By the time I went to bed that night, I wasn't angry anymore. I was motivated. I had no idea then just how far this feud would go, or how much it would change not only my life, but the entire neighborhood. Because once I started building my castle wall, there was no turning back. Once the idea took root, it was all I could think about. The fence that had once been a source of irritation became an opportunity. I wasn't just fixing a boundary anymore, I was about to make a statement, the kind of statement no HOA committee could ignore and no Karen could control. I spent the next few nights researching, planning, and sketching out designs. My desk was covered with drawings, printouts of medieval fortifications, and rough estimates scrawled in the margins of notebook paper. I looked up local building codes, checked zoning regulations, and read through every clause in the HOA guidelines. I wanted to know exactly where the line was, so I could stand on it and wave. As it turned out, the HOA had restrictions on fence materials and height, but nothing about decorative facades or theming. The rules specified a maximum of 6 feet for fencing, but said nothing about ornamental extensions, provided they were non-structural. That one line, barely noticeable to most homeowners, was my golden ticket. I wasn't going to build a new fence. I was going to decorate the existing one. It started simply enough. I ordered stone-textured panels that could be attached to the fence face. They were lightweight, weather-resistant, and surprisingly convincing. From a distance, they looked like hand-laid granite. My idea was to cover the entire fence in these panels, transforming the bland wooden barrier into a fortress wall. Then came the accents. I found ornamental turrets online, foam molds designed for theatrical sets. I reinforced them, mounted them to the corners, and even added small crenellations along the top edge. The more I worked on it, the more it felt like my own private castle was coming to life. But the centerpiece, the real crown jewel of my plan, was the gate. I designed a faux drawbridge for the driveway, using heavy wood panels connected with decorative iron hinges. It didn't actually raise or lower, of course, but it looked like it could. I even added a pair of imitation chains on either side, giving the illusion that the whole thing could lift with a pulley system. When I finally stood back and looked at the concept sketches, I had to laugh. It was absurd, ridiculous, petty even. But it was also beautiful, and more importantly, it was legal. I hired a local handyman to help me with the heavy work, careful to phrase everything in terms that wouldn't raise alarms. I told him I was creating a medieval-themed garden enclosure, which wasn't exactly a lie. The day the materials arrived, Karen was outside again, watering her already perfect flowers. She paused when the delivery truck stopped in front of my house, her eyes narrowing as she read the labels on the boxes. Stone facade panels, decorative masonry, iron accents. She didn't say a word, but I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. By the time we started installing the first section, she was already on the phone. Probably the HOA, maybe even the police again. But I didn't care. I had my permits. I had my loopholes. And I had every intention of finishing what I started. As the first wall went up, neighbors began to notice. Some slowed their cars to stare. Others stopped mid-walk with their dogs, whispering among themselves. I could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation building like static before a storm. Within days, the once ordinary street began buzzing with curiosity. People wanted to know what I was doing, what the HOA would say, and how far I was willing to go. Karen, of course, was furious. I could tell by the way she started avoiding eye contact. Instead of confronting me directly, she began posting on the neighborhood Facebook page. Screenshots were later shared with me by a sympathetic neighbor. Her posts read like battle dispatches. Neighbor's fence turning into a monstrosity, possible property value concern, and unsanctioned construction next door. It was pure gold. The HOA scheduled an emergency meeting. I received a notice in my mailbox, neatly folded and stamped with their seal of authority. But I was ready. At the meeting, they tried to sound official, talking about neighborhood harmony, aesthetic continuity, and how my project violated the spirit of the community. I calmly explained that I was in full compliance with every rule. The fence was the same height. The materials met safety codes. And nowhere did the rules prohibit decorative facades or themes. They had nothing. I walked out of that meeting feeling untouchable. The construction continued. By week 3, the castle wall was fully up. It wrapped around my property like something out of a fantasy movie. The faux stone shimmered under the sunlight, The turrets framed the corners, and the gate, oh, the gate, was a masterpiece. I even added small torches on either side, wired with low-voltage LED lights that flickered like real flames. At night when I turned them on, the whole thing glowed with a warm amber hue. It looked majestic, and ridiculous, and perfect. Of course, Karen lost her mind. She complained daily, to the HOA, to the city, even to local law enforcement. But every time the answer was the same. He's not breaking any laws. And the more she pushed, the more attention the situation drew. Word spread beyond the neighborhood. People started driving by just to see the castle fence. Kids took selfies in front of it. Even a local news crew came by one afternoon to do a short feature. That's when I realized something incredible had happened. What began as a petty revenge project had become a local legend. My little act of defiance had turned into a spectacle. And the HOA, for all their bluster, could do nothing about it. But while most of the neighborhood had started to embrace the absurdity, Karen wasn't finished. Not even close. Because if there's one thing a Karen hates more than being ignored, it's being laughed at. And soon she'd find a new way to fight back. One that would push our petty war to an entirely new level. At first, I thought the storm had passed. The castle wall stood tall and proud, its stone-textured panels gleaming in the sunlight. Every time I drove home and saw that ridiculous, magnificent facade, I couldn't help but smile. The neighbors had adjusted. Most of them even liked it. Kids called it the Castle House. People waved when they passed by. For the first time in months, I actually enjoyed living there again. But peace, as I learned, never lasts long when you're dealing with an HOA, and certainly not when a Karen is involved. Karen had gone quiet for a few weeks. Too quiet. She no longer posted on the neighborhood Facebook group. She stopped pacing near the property line. Even her constant glares seemed to vanish. I thought maybe she'd finally given up. Then the letters started coming again. This time, they weren't from the HOA board. They were from their lawyer. The first letter claimed that my decorative additions violated the community's design covenant. The second accused me of detracting from neighborhood property values. The third demanded immediate removal or modification of any elements inconsistent with community standards. It was clear what was happening. Karen had escalated. She had managed to convince the HOA board to hire legal counsel. And now, instead of annoying fines or empty threats, they were coming after me with formal complaints. I responded with calm, professional letters of my own, each one backed by documented proof, photos, and citations from the HOA's own rulebook. I even had the city inspector verify that my modifications were compliant with all building codes. I wasn't bluffing anymore. I had everything in writing. But they kept pushing. The HOA called another meeting, this time described as a formal hearing. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt different. Tense, organized. They had binders, folders, and a projector displaying pictures of my property as if it were a crime scene. They opened with statements about community image and collective value. One of them, clearly reading from notes, described my home as a medieval eyesore that threatens the aesthetic cohesion of the neighborhood. Another called it a monument to defiance. I had to suppress a laugh at that one. When they finished their speeches, I calmly reminded them that the HOA's own bylaws allowed decorative architectural enhancements, so long as they were structurally sound and did not exceed 6 feet in height. I had abided by every rule. They didn't like that. Karen, who was sitting in the front row like a prosecutor ready to pounce, demanded they reinterpret the guidelines to include thematic consistency. In other words, she wanted to invent new rules on the spot. But even the HOA's attorney seemed hesitant. He quietly admitted that enforcing new standards retroactively would likely violate fair practice. I could tell the board was frustrated. They wanted to punish me, but they couldn't find a way to do it legally. So they did what HOAs do best. They stalled. They began sending daily inspections, citing me for unrelated things, trash cans left out an hour too long, a garden hose coiled the wrong way, even excessive decorative lighting. It was harassment disguised as procedure. They couldn't take down my wall, so they tried to make my life miserable. Karen, meanwhile, started her own campaign. She went door to door gathering signatures for a community petition to restore neighborhood harmony. I overheard her telling people that my castle wall was scaring potential buyers. But something unexpected happened. Most of the neighbors refused to sign. Many of them had grown tired of the HOA's overreach. They'd seen me stand up to them, and in a strange way it inspired them. Some even started pushing back in their own ways, planting colorful gardens that didn't match the HOA palette, adding quirky lawn ornaments, or painting their doors bright, bold colors. The more the HOA tried to tighten control, the more the neighborhood rebelled. Karen couldn't stand it. She ramped up her efforts, filing noise complaints when my tools made the slightest sound, claiming that the LED torches were a fire hazard, and even accusing me of attracting tourists. When none of that worked, she made one last desperate move. She contacted a local real estate agent and tried to have my property appraised as a distressed asset. Her goal was simple: to prove that my home's value had dropped because of my unacceptable modifications. It backfired spectacularly. When the appraiser arrived, he turned out to be one of those guys who loved unique homes. He told me he'd never seen anything like it in the area and that, if anything, my house had increased in value because of its novelty and attention from local media. That report destroyed Karen's credibility overnight, but it didn't stop the HOA. A week later, I received notice that they were taking the matter to arbitration. They were officially suing me for violating the spirit of the community covenant. It was absurd, but it was real. I'd gone from replacing a fence to facing a full-blown legal battle against the HOA. And Karen was at the center of it all, smiling every time I passed her house. Still, I wasn't scared. I had evidence, community support, and something stronger than either of those: resolve. I wasn't going to be bullied into conformity. If they wanted to make this a war, I was ready. So while the HOA prepared their case, I started preparing something else, something they didn't expect. If they thought my castle wall was outrageous, they hadn't seen anything yet, because if they wanted to drag me into court, I was going to show up not as a defendant, but as a king defending his castle. When the notice of arbitration arrived, it felt surreal. A dispute that started over a simple wooden fence had now evolved into a neighborhood-wide spectacle, with lawyers, petitions, and local gossip fueling every rumor. The HOA was officially suing me for disrupting neighborhood unity and diminishing collective property value. They couldn't point to any broken laws or violations, so they went after something more abstract: the spirit of the community. It sounded ridiculous, because it was. But absurdity is a weapon the HOA wields well. They count on exhaustion, on people giving up before the fight becomes too costly. But this time, they'd picked the wrong person. I decided to go on the offensive. I started documenting everything: photos of the fence, every letter, every interaction. I even filmed short videos explaining the timeline. Not as public posts at first, just records for myself. But when a friend convinced me to share them online, they exploded. The internet loved it. Within a week, my videos had thousands of views. People couldn't get enough of the castle wall guy versus the HOA. Comments poured in from all over: homeowners, renters, even former HOA board members who shared their own horror stories. What had once been a private feud had turned into public entertainment. Karen, of course, hated it. She accused me of defaming the community and attracting the wrong kind of attention. But the truth was, people loved the story. I wasn't defaming anyone. I was simply showing the world what was happening: the pettiness, the hypocrisy, and the way one neighbor's obsession had spiraled out of control. Soon after the first video went viral, a local news outlet picked it up. They ran a short feature titled "The Suburban Castle," when HOA rules go too far. That's when everything changed. The neighborhood became a circus. Cars drove by daily, people slowed down to take photos, and one morning a food truck even parked across the street, selling coffee and pastries under a banner that read Castle Grounds Cafe. It was hilarious, and a little insane, but it was also a turning point. The HOA's reputation was taking a hit. Their board members, who had once held so much quiet power, now looked foolish. The news interviews painted them as petty bureaucrats obsessed with controlling everyone's lives. Karen tried to give a counter-interview, claiming the castle wall was destroying the peace, but it only made things worse. The internet labeled her the gatekeeper. Memes spread like wildfire. She became the villain in a story she'd written herself. Meanwhile, I was getting messages from strangers, lawyers offering advice, homeowners thanking me for standing up, even one guy from out of state asking if he could visit Castle Drive to take photos for his vlog. What started as petty revenge had become a viral rebellion. Still, I knew the real battle wasn't online. It was in the arbitration hearing, and that day came faster than I expected. The HOA arrived first, dressed formally, armed with binders and statements. Karen was there too, sitting with the board, her expression smug and certain. They believed they'd finally cornered me, but I had done my homework. When it was my turn to speak, I laid out everything: the harassment, the inconsistent enforcement of rules, the biased targeting, and the loopholes they'd ignored. I presented the inspection reports, legal permits, and HOA bylaws that supported every modification I'd made. Then I delivered the final blow. I presented a petition, signed by over 70% of the neighborhood, supporting my right to keep the wall. Some had even written personal notes. He made this street fun again. Finally, someone stood up to the HOA. Let the man have his castle. When I finished, the room went silent. Even the arbitrator seemed impressed. He leaned back, flipping through the documents before quietly saying that everything appeared to be within the HOA's own guidelines. He reminded the board that the spirit of the community was subjective and unenforceable. Karen's face turned pale. The decision was clear. I had won. The HOA had no authority to demand changes or issue fines. My castle wall was here to stay. The board members murmured among themselves, defeated. But Karen wasn't finished. She stood, visibly trembling, and accused me of manipulating the neighborhood, of turning her home into a sideshow. The arbitrator calmly told her that personal grievances weren't legal grounds for enforcement. That was the moment. She lost everything: her power, her influence, and whatever credibility she still clung to. The hearing ended with a formal ruling in my favor. The HOA was ordered to cease all fines and remove any outstanding penalties. When I walked out of that building, the autumn air felt lighter. For the first time since moving into that neighborhood, I felt completely free. But the story didn't end there. When word spread that I'd won, the neighborhood erupted in quiet celebration. People dropped by with congratulations. Someone even left a small flag at the base of the wall with a note that said, "Long live the castle." But not everyone was happy. Karen became reclusive. She stopped coming to meetings. Her once immaculate garden began to wilt. Her husband, who had mostly stayed out of things, put up a for sale sign within a month, and soon after the moving trucks arrived. The woman who once ruled the neighborhood was gone, and yet despite everything, I didn't feel triumph. I felt peace, the kind that comes from knowing you've stood your ground without backing down. Still, victory in an HOA battle doesn't last forever, because even when one Karen leaves, another usually takes her place. And as I looked out over my castle wall that evening, lights glowing softly against the stone texture, I couldn't help but wonder, what kind of kingdom had I built? And how long would it stand before the next challenge came knocking? After the hearing, life in the neighborhood changed in ways I never expected. For months, my castle wall had been the center of tension, a symbol of rebellion, defiance, and absurdity. But after the ruling, when the HOA's grip loosened and Karen's influence vanished, The entire atmosphere of the street began to shift. It was as if the neighborhood took a deep breath for the first time in years. The fear of petty fines disappeared almost overnight. People began experimenting, small things at first. A family down the street painted their shutters bright red. Another homeowner added a small fountain to their front yard without bothering to ask for approval. Someone even hung string lights across their porch year-round, something that would have driven the old board mad. The perfect suburb look that Karen had fought so hard to protect started to unravel. And honestly, it looked better that way. It looked real. The castle wall itself became an unexpected landmark. At first I thought people would get tired of it, that the novelty would fade once the drama died down. But the opposite happened. Families came by on weekends to take photos. Kids from nearby schools started calling it Castle Drive. During Halloween, my house became the main event. I leaned into it fully, dressing the yard with torches, faux battlements, and a smoke machine. It was a hit. Even local businesses started referencing it. The nearby coffee shop added a castle latte to their menu for a month as a joke, and the HOA, the same one that tried to tear it all down, quietly stopped mentioning decorative consistency in any of their newsletters. The irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA board still existed, but without Karen, they were quieter, more reasonable. The new president, a calm and level-headed guy named Mark, actually stopped by one afternoon to compliment the craftsmanship. He said almost sheepishly that the board had learned a lesson about flexibility. It was the nicest thing an HOA member had ever said to me. But while the local peace was restored, the internet had other plans. My videos, the ones I'd originally uploaded just to document the process, kept gaining traction. Before long, other creators picked up the story. They did reaction videos, commentaries, even animations retelling the saga. One channel with millions of subscribers dubbed it The Great Wall of Suburbia. And then, national media took notice. A producer from a morning talk show reached out. They wanted me to come on and share my story. A modern-day David versus Goliath tale, they called it. I laughed at the idea, but eventually I agreed. When I sat on that stage, under the studio lights, I couldn't help but think about how absurd it all was. Months earlier, I had been standing in my backyard, frustrated over a fence. And now here I was, telling millions of people how that same fence had become a castle, both literally and metaphorically. The host asked if I had any regrets. I said no, not one, because the truth was, the wall wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about principle, about standing your ground when someone tries to control every inch of your life. The audience applauded, and for a brief moment, I felt like I had become something of a folk hero for homeowners everywhere. When I returned home, I found a letter in my mailbox. It wasn't from the HOA this time. It was from a stranger, handwritten. They said they had watched the story online, and that it gave them courage to push back against their own unreasonable HOA. They ended the letter with a simple line, "Thanks for building your wall. You reminded us we can build ours too." That hit me harder than I expected. It made me realize that the whole thing, the stress, the fines, the meetings, even Karen's endless complaining, had meant something. The castle wall had started as an act of spite, but it ended as something far more meaningful. Still, not everyone saw it that way. A few months after the arbitration, a new family moved into Karen's old house. They were friendly enough, though cautious. I could tell they'd heard the stories. The wife mentioned once that people in town referred to our block as the Castle Street. She said it with a laugh, but I caught a glimmer of curiosity in her eyes when she looked at the wall. I didn't mind. I'd rather live next to curiosity than control. As the seasons changed, so did my perspective. What used to be a source of frustration became a reminder, a monument to standing firm. Every stone-textured panel, every fake turret, every flickering torch told a story. Neighbors began to gather more often. We had block parties again. We laughed about the old days of HOA tyranny and the drama that had defined our little slice of suburbia. People who had once stayed quiet now spoke freely. The community, once uniform and tense, was finally alive. But despite the peace, there was a lingering thought in the back of my mind, because if this whole ordeal had taught me anything, it was that power, even petty suburban power, doesn't disappear. It waits, it shifts, it finds new forms, and sure enough, that truth would show itself again. Because one day, a letter arrived, not from the old HOA, but from something new, a community improvement committee, rebranded with fresh faces and a new logo. They claimed to represent the next generation of neighborhood management. And right there, in the fine print, was a new proposal. All exterior modifications must be pre-approved by the committee to ensure aesthetic alignment with community standards. I stared at it for a long moment, then laughed. History, it seemed, had a way of repeating itself, but this time I wasn't angry. I wasn't anxious, because now I had my castle, and if they wanted to test me again, well, I'd already proven that this kingdom doesn't fall easily. Years passed. The neighborhood, once a battleground of conformity and control, slowly transformed into something almost unrecognizable from what it had been. Gone were the days of identical houses and perfect lawns that all looked the same under the morning sun. The street had character now, imperfections that made it beautiful. A bright yellow front door here, a mismatched garden gnome there, and right in the middle of it all stood the castle wall, weathered but strong, a strange and proud monument to a rebellion that had started with one stubborn neighbor. Over time, it became more than just a fence. It became a symbol. When new families moved into the neighborhood, they'd hear the story almost immediately. Some would laugh, others would shake their heads in disbelief, but everyone, every single one of them, would eventually take a walk past it, run their hand along the faux stone, and nod in quiet appreciation. It represented something they all felt, but rarely said out loud: the right to call your home your own. By the 5th year, the wall had taken on a life of its own. The LED torches had long since been replaced with more efficient ones, and the once foam turrets were now rebuilt in real stone by a local mason who insisted on doing it properly. The castle had become part of the town's identity. There were postcards featuring it, local businesses that used its silhouette in their logos, and even a yearly neighborhood fair called Castle Fest, where residents gathered for food, games, and stories. The HOA, or rather, what was left of it, had evolved too. The new leadership was pragmatic, relaxed, and far more community-driven. They focused on real issues: safety, maintenance, inclusivity, rather than dictating the shade of everyone's mailbox. And through it all, I stayed quietly proud. Sometimes I'd stand in my yard and remember the chaos, the fines, the arguments, the meetings, the headlines. It all seemed so distant now, like a dream I'd woken from. But every time I looked at that wall, I felt the echo of those days. Not with anger or regret, but with gratitude. Because that ridiculous wall had changed everything. It had changed me. It taught me that sometimes peace isn't found by avoiding conflict. It's found by facing it, by standing firm against those who think they know what's best for you, even when they don't. And strangely enough, it also taught me empathy. I didn't hate Karen anymore. In hindsight, I saw her for what she was: someone terrified of losing control in a world that was changing faster than she could handle. Her legacy had faded, but in a strange way, she'd helped shape mine. Years later, I received an email from a journalist working on a feature about modern neighborhood revolutions. They called the castle wall an architectural act of defiance. I smiled at that phrase. It sounded so grand, so deliberate, but I knew the truth. It had started as nothing more than frustration and a touch of pettiness. And yet, out of that chaos had come something oddly inspiring. One evening, I was standing outside, watching the sunset cast long shadows across the wall, when I noticed an older couple walking by. They paused at the gate, admiring the structure. The man turned and said, "I've heard about this place for years. My son told me you're the reason his HOA backed off when they tried to ban his mural. It caught me off guard. I smiled and nodded, unsure what to say. The couple thanked me and continued walking, their voices fading down the street. I stood there for a while longer, the air calm and still. In that moment, I realized that the castle wall was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been told they couldn't plant a tree, hang a light, or paint a wall without someone's permission. It stood for freedom, the small personal kind that makes a house a home, and it wasn't just a structure anymore. It was a story, one that would outlive me, retold by new homeowners who would never meet Karen, never attend those exhausting meetings, but would still feel the echo of what happened here. The neighborhood thrived. The children who used to ride their bikes past my gate grew up remembering it not as a feud, but as the house that made their street special. Sometimes, when I sat on the porch, I could hear them telling newcomers, "That's the castle wall, the one that started it all." And that's when it truly hit me. Revenge fades, anger fades, even victory fades, but stories, the good ones, they last. What began as a petty act of defiance had become a legacy. And as I looked up at the wall, glowing softly in the twilight, I couldn't help but laugh, because in the end, I hadn't just built a fence, I'd built a legend.